Good afternoon. My name is Gayle Dendinger. I am the CEO of ICOSA Media. This afternoon we have the Pulitzer Prize winning author Hedrick Smith, who lets us call him Rick. You can call me Gayle because there's no variation of what you can do with Gayle. But I found your talk yesterday fascinating on some very timely issues. I am a child of history, a little bit younger than you, but I went through the same eras that you did and had no idea of the touch points that went on during the last 40 years that have got us in the situation that we're in today.
I didn't either when I started out. I mean, I knew some of them from experience, but I learned a lot more writing this book, Who Stole the American Dream. I mean, I didn't start out to write this book. I had to learn what's in it.
So the one thing that we have in common is we're fans of Charles Schulz. And you started out yesterday with a little story about Lucy. Can you start with that again
Yeah,
today?
sure. Well, I was trying to figure out a simple, nice, and sort of lighthearted way to talk about America's predicament today. And it reminded me of the great Charles Schulz Peanuts cartoon. It's the one where Lucy has a table set up in the backyard and it says, "Psychiatry, 1 cent." Well, you know who walks up. Charlie Brown walks up and he says, "Lucy, here's my penny." And she says to Charlie Brown, "Well, before I can give you advice and do any psychiatry with you, Charlie," she said, "you have to think of life as a voyage on a great ocean liner. Are you one of those people who takes your deck chair up to the bow and looks up into the future to where you're going? Or are you one of those people who takes your deck chair to the stern and looks back to see where you're coming from?" And Charlie thought for a moment and scratched his head and said, "Lucy, I'm having trouble getting my chair unfolded."
Pretty much sums it up, doesn't it?
It does. Well, then I read a couple of more serious quotes from more serious people, but that's yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the way a lot of people in America feel today about the situation. They can't quite figure it out. Our politics is screwed up. All we get is gridlock from Washington. When we say what we want, the politicians and the lobbyists don't pay any attention. The economy's in a mess. Jobs are, it's long unemployment. People are being pushed out of their homes. Jobs are going overseas. People don't know whether or not they can save enough for their retirement or their kids' college. So, yeah, I mean, to a lot of very average people in America today, the situation's in a mess. We don't know how we got here. We're supposed to vote in an election. We got more questions than we have answers. We really don't trust politicians. What do we do? How do we get here?
So you actually pointed out, and I forgot over time, that there was not always acrimony.
No.
So you go back to about 1970, and it seemed like people were on the same page. Maybe the times weren't so desperate.
Yeah.
But a lot has changed since then, and you've identified a whole bunch of different aha moments that you've pulled together where it has eventually led to the situation we're in today. So can you go through a little bit of a chronology as you investigated
I will,
this?
but let me pause a moment at the beginning. Let's start the chronology back in the 60s and 70s, because people today don't really remember very well what it was like before. There was a time when the middle class was doing pretty darn well enough for Richard Nixon to tell the Soviet Communist leader Nikita Khrushchev, "We have a classless society," right? And the famous kitchen debate in Moscow. What happened was, back in that period, after World War II, for 30, 35 years, the middle class was sharing in the gains of the American economy. The American economy went up, wages went up, living standards went up, people had steady jobs, they had rising wages, maybe not dramatically, but steadily rising wages and salaries over their lifetime, health benefits, retirement check every month from their employer when they retired at 65, maybe enough money that they could buy a home, buy a car, down payment, monthly payments, did it religiously. You wound up sort of secure at 65. What's interesting, Gayle, and you probably remember this, and it's in the timeline. If you take the timeline from 1945 to 1973, the productivity of the American workforce grew 97%. Tremendous achievement for the country as a whole. And the average hourly compensation of an ordinary American went up 95%. 97% productivity, 95% salary increase. Okay? So the middle class was sharing in it. Not only that, but the CEOs at that time, the guys who ran General Motors or General Electric or Standard Oil of New Jersey, they believed their job was to share the wealth. They were worried about balancing the interests of the stakeholders in the company. Stakeholders, not shareholders. Stakeholders include shareholders, but it also includes workers, suppliers, creditors, customers, bosses, communities where the companies were. So there was this notion that you had shared wealth. And what the economists call that is the Great Convergence. What they mean is the level of the salaries at the top are fairly close to the middle, and the ones in the middle are fairly close to the bottom. What we have today is the Great Divergence. Top's way up here, bottom's way down here, and the middle is actually right about where it was back in 1970, 75, 78, something like that. So that's our starting point. So we want to go back on this timeline. We need to know what our baseline is. And we also need to understand that it was possible to do. And one of the ways it was possible to do is that the middle class had power. Consumer movement, labor movement, women's movement, environmental movement, civil rights movement, peace movement. These were all mass movements of middle-class Americans, women, blacks, suburbanites, young kids, college kids, high school kids, old folks. People got involved, and they put the heat on Washington. And Washington actually responded. Now, that sounds weird today because people don't do that, and they don't feel as though Washington responds. But it's very important to know that not that long ago in our history, that actually happened. So that's where I like to start. You can tell me where you want to go next.
Well, one of the thoughts I have, and probably should be taken off the record, but one of my good friends is Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Right.
And he still enjoys a good march. He was here in Denver about a year ago, and the Hispanic population was marching, and it was everything for him not to be able to go out in the street and march with him.
Yeah.
I marched back in the 60s,
right.
So I'm not sure when we were marching what we were doing. Did we have an effect when we did
Absolutely.
that?
No, well, if you were marching about the war, you helped shorten the war. Listen, 20 million people, 20 million Americans were out on one day, April 22nd, 1970, Earth Day, 1970. And why were they out there? They were angry, they were outraged, they were furious at the fouling of America's air and the fouling of America's waterways, at the smog over L.A., at the fact that the Cuyahoga River outside Cleveland was so full of chemicals. Listen to this, it actually burst into flames repeatedly. So people wanted that stuff cleaned up. They wanted the asbestos out of their basements. They wanted the stink out of the sky, right? So they protested, and literally within a year, 7 major pieces of environmental legislation were passed by Congress. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Anti-Toxic Substances Act. Richard Nixon, Republican president, who loved CEOs, loved to go down with B.B. Rebozo in Key Biscayne, Florida, and hobnob with the chiefs of American industry, the captains of American industry. He loved the big guys, but he thought business had to be restrained, and he was responding to public pressure. And Bill Ruckelshaus is a friend of mine who ran the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, for Richard Nixon, the first guy who did it, said to me, you know, that's the way democracy is supposed to work. The people speak and the government responds. We have an obligation to respond to what people want. Now, that's not exactly the way things are going nowadays. I just want to put a benchmark down there so we know kind of what the arc is that we've gone through and the distance we've traveled to a really effective democracy. And that was the underpinning of American middle-class prosperity. Power and prosperity, power in the economy, politics and the economy, they go together. We have highly unequal economy right now. We have highly unequal politics. Those two things go together. And actually, people have done charts, and they'll show you how these things actually move together over a century in American history.
I've always believed that there was a false economy for middle-income people because of World War II. The manufacturing base before World War II, I think we had 22% of the manufacturing. And after World War II, then it was something like 45% because Russia and England and China, Japan had lost, through bombing, had lost their capacity. But when I was reading your book, then it says, you mentioned that, but you don't think that's really a part of a bubble that we lived through that set up the situation that we're in?
First of all, I don't think it was a bubble. Yes, absolutely, that was part of it. I mean, our potential economic competitors in the world lay prostrate. And we were the giants striding the world. But, that advantage disappears in about 15 years. You can go from 45 to 60.
Right.
But once you get to 60 in the 70s, that's no longer. I mean, European economy's back on its feet. The Russian economy's back on its feet. The Japanese economy is back. They're starting to challenge, and our share of world trade has come down rather dramatically by then. It's from the 70s onward that we're in real trouble.
So it wasn't from the 60s to the 70s, it was 70s.
70s onward, we start to get in real trouble, and it's because two big things change. Our economy changes, the way we do our economy changes, the way we share our wealth changes, and the same thing happens in politics. Political power changes. You don't have middle-class power anymore. You have power basically by corporate America. And it's actually started on purpose by an unusual guy, a guy named Lewis Powell, who people may remember as a Supreme Court justice, but before he went on the Supreme Court in 1972, he was a corporate attorney. And at that point, now remember I'm talking about middle-class power, I'm saying that helped spread the wealth. Lewis Powell thought that was going to hurt business, was going to hurt corporate America, was going to hurt the free enterprise system. So he said, business, you got to organize. You got to come to Washington. You're not even in Washington. Don't even have your offices here. Get your offices here. Get together. Stop fighting among each other. Identify your foes. Fight aggressive politics. Pool your money together. Sound familiar with the super PACs? Pool your money together. He's talking about that back in 1971. And there was an explosion of business political activity. Business Roundtable is formed, biggest, most powerful business organization of the CEOs, the biggest companies in America. Right 4 or 5 months after Lewis Powell's memo is circulated by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to business leaders very quietly. Those of us who were working in Washington writing stories about the politics and the economics at the time, we didn't know about that. This was I can't say it was clandestine, but it was done very privately. Let's just put it that way, right? And you had 175 companies with offices in Washington in 1971. Tune in a decade later, 2,425. 50,000 people working for trade associations, 9,000 registered corporate lobbyists. I mean, this is Powell's army. And it actually formed, and people didn't know it was forming if they weren't part of it. And it had tremendous impact. It had impact even before Ronald Reagan came to power.
So I'm a business person, but sort of on the soft side of being a Republican, so we do an awful lot of work for humanity. And only 1 week ago, I was in Iowa with John Engler, who is the CEO of the Roundtable. I'm always interested because of the magazine we have, which talks about collaboration.
Right.
What are the things that as Americans that we have in common? So, you know, you have a bunch of business people now that are very well organized and very, very powerful and have reach. Part of that's good, part of that's bad. But what are the parts of being organized where they work with the middle class and help the middle class?
Mm-hmm. Well, here's the situation. I mentioned to you that guys like Charlie Wilson at General Motors, Reg Jones at General Electric, Frank Abrams at Standard Oil of New Jersey, they believed their job was to collaborate. Yes, they had battles with their unions, and they fought over exactly how much pay the increase was going to be. But they didn't fight about the basic sharing of the wealth. You know, I talked to John Engler, who's the former Republican governor of Michigan,
right.
And you don't find the CEOs that John Engler is representing now talking about sharing the wealth. You even find the Business Roundtable lobbying. John Engler wasn't the guy who did it. It was his predecessor who did it, going up on Capitol Hill and saying, fighting any suggestion in law that the shareholders of a corporation should be able to cast votes that would throw out the CEO or any of the top officers in a binding vote of shareholders. Now, that's supposed to be American corporate democracy. The shareholders own the company. And the Business Roundtable saying, no, don't do that. We don't run companies that way. We're not that kind of democracy. That's a very different attitude than what you had 30 or 40 years ago. So there's been a change. And I don't think you're going to find the Business Roundtable leaders saying exactly the same thing today that they were saying before. And that's produced what I call wedge economics. Wedge economics to me means that there's a wedge that's been driven between the performance of the economy, the salaries of the CEOs, the growth of the nation's productivity, and the rewards that come to the middle and downward. There's a wedge in there. People above the wedge are doing just great, thank you very much. Corporate profits are back at near record levels. If they're at near record levels, why do we have 27 million Americans who are either unemployed, working part-time against their will, or have dropped out of the labor market? It means some folks at the bottom are in very bad shape and some folks at the top are in very good shape. Well, what about the middle? Census Bureau tells us in 2011 that the average male worker in 2011 if you adjust his pay for inflation, is making exactly the same amount of money he was making in 1978. Now that is 3 decades of going nowhere on a flat line. While the CEO pay is going up 350, 400%, and the pay for the people in the top 1% is going up 600%. Flat, 600%. Wedge economics. The productivity is going way up, and the wages aren't going up with it. Now, this is not to say that every member of the Business Roundtable or every business is doing that. There are businesses that are very conscientious in trying to take care of their people. Put Walmart and Costco side by side. I did a documentary for PBS on Walmart, okay? And one of the things we found out was that Walmart not only pays rather low pay, but they give very bad, very weak health benefits to their workers. And they're essentially dumping their workers on the public health system, on Medicaid. And I talked to Walmart managers, and I quote them in this book, who say they were told, and their job was to send them, their employees, to the public health system. Walmart was so embarrassed by some of these reports that they said, okay, we're going to improve our health benefits. And they did that in about 2008. And for 3 years, they paid better health benefits. In 2011, they announced, we can't afford that. We can't compete. We can't stay in the marketplace. We can't make a profit. Okay? Jim Sinegal, who's the CEO of Costco, who operates in exactly the same market, who does almost exactly the same kind of merchandising and selling on a mass basis in a big box retail store, says we have a responsibility to our employees. We are going to pay them a good health benefit. We have an obligation to our communities that we have our stores in not to dump our people on the health system. We're going to pay our people properly, and we're going to give them 2 health benefits. Now, what's interesting to notice beyond that is that Jim Sinegal took annual pay of $2 million a year, and the CEO at Walmart was taking $20 million a year. And the owners of Walmart, the Walton family, are 4 of the 11 richest people in America, and that family's wealth is equivalent to the wealth of the bottom 40% of the American population. Wedge economics, and it isn't the competitive situation that's doing it, because Jim Sinegal is running a very profitable firm at Costco, and he's able to take care of it. So I'm sorry, I don't buy the argument. It's wedge economics, and it's hurting. By the way, what's really important, Gayle, is it's not only hurting the employees. It's not only hurting the middle class. It is hurting the American economy. There are all kinds of economic studies done now on periods of American history and on other countries. And the economists have concluded that when you have high inequality of income, it hurts the growth of the economy of the country. And when you have this convergence, less difference between the middle and the bottom and the top, you have much better growth. Nobody's talking about equality. Nobody's talking about socialism in America. People know there are going to be differences. People know there have to be incentives to reward people who are bright, who work hard, who put in extra hours. But the differences we have in America today, even Citigroup, the bank, compared America today to 16th century Spain, 17th century Holland. I mean, those were times when enormous differences in wealth. I mean, that's something, as a country, we ought to be ashamed of, but most important, it isn't smart economics. It's hurting all of us.
I agree. Our company is a very strong company. We've been in business for more than 30 years, and our number one asset is our employees. So we do all kinds of different things to help our employees. We have not raised the portion that our employees pay for 11 years.
Good for you.
When the economy was in very tough shape, a lot of companies got rid of their 401k, which I know is another one of your issues. But
you picked up a lot.
We didn't change. Well, I'm giving you all these openings, so I'm really scared. You know? But we have many, many people down here that have been here between 15 and 20 years, some people more than that. And we feel that investing, maybe it's not investing in middle class as such. We're just investing in really, really, really good people.
It's investing in the middle class.
And it's paid benefits like you cannot believe. The same thing is we do a lot of different things as an extension of our magazine. A few years ago, then we actually worked with the Canadian forces and the U.S. government, and we collected materials. We moved a C-17 of humanitarian goods over to Afghanistan.
Wow, good for you.
And so we have found that those kind of things make us a better company, make us maybe more engaging to people that don't look at a job just in a little tiny box, But I agree with you that we have to share the resources we have. We have to take care of people.
Right.
I'm just always a little bit uncomfortable when my fellow business people are at odds, you know, with...
Sure.
So how do we get past it? We're talking about divisiveness.
Well, absolutely. And you know, we don't talk about America as a family anymore. You didn't use that term, but you were talking about your employees as part of a family.
Right. They're an extended family.
Correct. Okay. And that's the same way Jim Sinegal thinks. Okay. And so I'm not saying that all businessmen are bad. I don't believe that. My father was a businessman, and frankly, I've run a business for 20 years myself. Okay. So I'm in that field. It's a small business. I only make television productions, and so I don't have thousands of employees. I only have 10, 20, 30, 40 employees at one time or another, depending.
But you're bigger than life, so that makes up.
But I think it is really important for us to get back to some of the values and some of the ethics and some of the sense of commonality and sharing and compromise. You know, let's go from economics to politics. We're in a political era now where the word compromise is a dirty word. It's like the word collaboration, the word cooperation in economics. It's a dirty word. It's crazy. If you look at the system set up by our founding fathers, they deliberately divided power between the White House, the House, the Senate, and the judiciary. You can't possibly get those bodies together without compromising. And they said the majority would rule. So it's going to shift. We're going to have a period of progressivism, then we're going to have a period of conservatism. We're going to push to the right for a while, then we're going to push to the left for a while. And you look back at American history, and that's exactly what you see. And it's healthy. But we're now in a situation where we don't go right or left, we sit still. We're deadlocked. We can't move. When I started reporting in Washington in the 1960s, 8% of the legislation that came to the United States Senate was blocked by a filibuster or the threat of a filibuster. That is, talking it to death. Okay? Now, scholars have gone through. More than 70% of the legislation that comes to the floor of the Senate dies either from a filibuster or, more likely, the threat of a filibuster, because if you want to try to break a filibuster, you have to take hundreds of hours of debate to do it. So it never even gets discussed, and the American public doesn't even know it's going on. The Senate cannot even pass a budget. Year after year, the Senate fails to pass the budget. The House is almost as bad. I mean, I can tell you, during the years I've been in Washington as a reporter, I've just watched the deterioration of the quality of American democracy. And one reason is we've lost the political middle. When Lyndon Johnson went to try to pass his Medicare bill, 65 Republicans in the House and 13 Republican senators joined him. And the Republican alternative to Johnson's health care bill was very close to it in content. When Obama tried to pass Obamacare, he got 0 Republican votes. And do you know his Obamacare bill is less, call it socialistic, call it progressive, call it humanitarian, pick whatever adjective you want, but sort of to the left of center. Richard Nixon had a health care bill that was to the left of Obama's, a Republican president. That tells you how far our politics have moved. They've moved way to the right, and they've become much, much more divisive, and we can't get anything done. And we've got to find ways to break out of this. We've got to find ways where the voters get their will respected, where people are willing to compromise, and where you don't have one legislature, one Congress session trying to break and reverse what was done in the last session, which means, you know, our history is going to go zigzag. It's like a stock market that can't ever get on a rising platform, get on a rising incline, so that we're getting somewhere.
So this book is not about writing a book, is it? This is your contribution to trying to solve a problem, isn't it?
Well, I got to tell you, Gayle, yes, it didn't start out that way. This is a reporter's book. And what I mean by that is it started with questions. It didn't start with answers. There are a lot of people who write books and who say, I know what I want to say, I want to prove it, I'm going to nail it, and I'm going to shove it out there. I have to tell you, I didn't know that. I had a bunch of questions. How do we move from bipartisanship and middle-class prosperity to gridlock and middle class being stuck in a rut? How did that happen? So I just kept asking questions, and the more questions I asked, it led me back further. And I looked at health care, and I looked at retirement, 401k plans, and I looked at job offshoring, and then I looked at job offshoring for high-tech people and for people in the knowledge economy. And then I looked at the importing of workers. And then I looked at the housing crisis. I went through one thing after another, and I began to see patterns. And I began to see power shifts. And I began to see this wedge economics that I was talking about in one field after another. And I got to tell you, I'm really worried about our country. I think we're in terrible shape. This book begins with Arnold Toynbee, who was a famous British historian. And Toynbee was concerned about trying to understand the rise and fall of civilizations over 6,000 years. He examined 21 civilizations. Now, some civilizations have risen and fallen by military power. They won and they conquered other civilizations, and other civilizations died because they lost. And some were destroyed by environmental disasters, floods, endless rains, or dry spells, droughts, just the opposite. But two civilizations of great importance to us, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, both of them declined because of internal divisions. The city-states of Greece came to war over internal trade, and they declined, and actually Rome succeeded them. And Rome declined because of internal divisions in Rome. When I look at America today, what I see is a nation divided by money, by power, and by ideological rigidity. And I'm reminded of what Abraham Lincoln said, a house divided cannot stand. And I'm reminded of what Arnold Toynbee said about ancient Greece and Rome, ancient Greece and Rome. And so when I write this book, I'll be honest with you, I'm writing with a passion because I care about this country. And I think we can recover. But we're hearing a lot of nonsense about great days ahead. It's going to be hard. And we're going to have to do things we didn't want to do. We're going to have to face up to problems we haven't wanted to face up to. We're going to have people tell us things. And this book will tell people things that they would just as soon not know. But we aren't going to get a smart fix. We're not going to get a good fix in this country unless we face up to how we got to where we are and then start to work together as a family, the way you're talking about working in your company, to move it ahead. And so, yeah, I care about it. This is not just a book to me. This is my ideas, this is my reporting, and it's my contribution to my country.
I can see that. Do you have grandkids?
I do. 8.
Tell me about your grandkids with respect to your book.
Well, I'm taking a moment to put on my glasses, and the reason I'm taking a moment to put on my glasses, I want to read you the dedication.
I must have missed this.
No. To Susan, my wife, and to a better future for our children and grandchildren and their generations. That's what this book is for. There is no more precious time I have in my life than with my kids and my family. And if we pass on the Charlie Brown mess that I was talking about, we're having trouble getting our chart unfolded. If we pass that on to our kids, and this isn't just about the deficit. People are talking about the financial deficit. What about the human deficit? What about 27 million people out there desperate to work, and they can't find work in America, the land of opportunity? Gayle, we're no longer the land of opportunity. Do you know that?
Oh, absolutely.
You can rise faster in Germany, France, Scandinavia, several other countries, faster than America. I mean, what a terrible thing to have happened in our lifetime. So we can't give that to our grandkids.